The sun over the South Carolina fields was a cruel master of its own, beating down upon rows of cotton and bent backs glistening with sweat. The air shimmered thick with dust and sorrow. Beneath that merciless light, one man towered above the rest, Samuel Rivers, the giant slave of Hallow Plantation. He was a mountain of a man, 6.5 feet tall, with arms thick as oaken limbs, and a silence that made the overseers uneasy. His strength was both his curse and his survival. When the others faltered beneath the weight of the sacks, Samuel carried 2, sometimes 3, without a word. The others whispered that God had built him different, that maybe his size was heaven's mistake or its promise. The field boss, Caleb Vane, barked orders from horseback. "Move, you beasts! Sun ain't waiting for no one." The crack of the whip punctuated his voice like thunder, and every lash in the air made Samuel's jaw tighten. But he didn't flinch, not even when the lash caught someone beside him. His body bore enough scars to write a history on. At the far end of the field stood the house, white and gleaming, like a lie pretending to be holy. Behind its shutters, Master Edward Hallow watched with a glass of bourbon in hand. He liked to watch Samuel work. There was something about seeing power harnessed, strength tamed. It made Edward feel like a god in his own kingdom of red soil and misery. "Look at him," Edward muttered to his visiting cousin that day. "Big as an ox, quiet as a stone. My own Goliath. You won't find a finer beast in all of Carolina." The cousin laughed, but Samuel heard. He always heard. The words rolled through him like heat through iron, twisting, reshaping, hardening. But his eyes never lifted. His body obeyed the rhythm of survival, though his soul whispered rebellion in silence. At dusk, when the horn sounded and the field emptied, Samuel carried his load to the barn. The others staggered behind him, exhausted. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of hay and blood, the remnants of punishments past. Samuel stacked the last sack and straightened, towering under the dim lantern light. "Samuel," a sharp voice called. It was Aunt May, the elderly woman who kept the quarters in order and patched the broken bodies after each day. "Boy, you gonna break yourself in half working like that?" He managed a faint smile, the kind that flickered and vanished quick. "Ain't much left to break, May." She sighed, shaking her head. "You keep carrying the world. It'll bury you, child." But he didn't answer. Words had little use in a place where voices meant punishment. That night in the quarters, the slaves sat close, whispering stories to drown the pain. Someone hummed a hymn low, like a prayer too tired to rise. Samuel sat by the corner, sharpening a wooden handle into a clean edge. Not for violence, for control. In a world ruled by another man's whim, the small acts of shaping something were a form of quiet defiance. From outside came the sound of hooves and laughter, white laughter, sharp as broken glass. The plantation house was alive again, filled with guests and brandy. Samuel's stomach turned with the sound. Every cheer felt like mockery hurled at the lives shackled in the fields. Later, as the night deepened, the door to the quarters creaked open. Caleb stood there, a whip coiled in his hand, a grin on his face. "You, giant, master wants you up at the house, says it's time to entertain." The room went still. Everyone knew what that meant. Edward liked to show off his giant, make him lift wagons, pull ropes, prove his strength before men who called themselves civilized. Samuel rose slowly, his shadow filling the doorway. "Yes, sir," he said flatly. Up at the porch, under lantern light, Edward stood waiting in a cream waistcoat, his teeth gleaming beneath a cruel smile. "Ah, there he is. Gentlemen, behold the might of my plantation. Samuel Rivers, strongest slave in the state." Laughter erupted. Edward tossed a heavy barrel toward him. "Lift it." Samuel obeyed, muscles flexing beneath the torn fabric of his shirt. He raised it high, veins burning, face impassive. The guests clapped, drunk and delighted. Edward stepped closer, inspecting his prized man. "You see, gentlemen, they only need a firm hand and fear. That's how you make them useful." The words stabbed deeper than any whip. Samuel lowered the barrel gently, his eyes meeting Edward's for the briefest moment. In that instant, something unspoken passed, not defiance, not yet, but a seed. Edward noticed the look. He smirked, swirling his drink. "Careful, boy. Eyes like that can get a man killed." Samuel bowed his head. "Yes, master." The laughter resumed, but inside him, Beneath that bowed head, something ancient began to stir, something waiting for the right night, the right storm. As the moon hung high over the fields, Samuel walked back to his quarters. The cicadas screamed in the distance, the sound sharp and restless. He paused once to look back at the great house, glowing white against the black of the trees, his fists clenched without thought. He didn't know it yet, but the man standing in that moonlight, silent, scarred and waiting, would one day bring that house to ashes. The following evening came heavy with the smell of tobacco and sweat. The house on the hill was lit like a lantern, every window glowing gold against the black sky. Music drifted faintly across the fields, laughter, the ring of crystal, a piano that sang false joy into the night. Down in the quarters, no one laughed. Every note from that piano meant the white men were drinking again, and when they drank, someone paid for it. Samuel sat at the edge of the cot, sharpening a broken hoe handle to pass the time. Across from him, young Isaac, barely 16, whispered to his sister through the cracks in the wall. His voice trembled like a leaf in wind. "They took Thomas last night," Isaac said. "Didn't come back till morning. Ain't said a word since." Samuel didn't look up. "He's breathin', that's what matters." But his tone was cold, flat, the kind of cold that grows when a man stops believing in mercy. Suddenly, the door burst open. Caleb Vane stepped in, smelling of whiskey and smoke, his whip dangling loose from his hand. "On your feet, Master says it's showtime again." A wave of dread rolled through the room. The men stood in silence, the air thick with quiet rage. Samuel rose slowly, his height swallowing the lamplight. Caleb's grin widened. "Big boy, you're comin' with me. Bring that strength of yours guests aboard." The ride up to the house was quiet, hooves crunching against dry earth. Samuel's wrists were chained, though they didn't need to be, not yet. When they reached the back porch, he could hear the clinking of glasses, the drawl of men talking about cotton yields and discipline. Edward Hallow stood on the veranda, coat unbuttoned, cigar in his teeth. His eyes lit when he saw Samuel. "Gentlemen," he called, his voice slick as oil, "you want to see something magnificent?" He gestured towards Samuel. "This man once carried a plow through a flooded field when 3 horses couldn't pull it. I swear to God, strength like this, it's divine." A murmur of impressed disbelief rippled through the crowd. Edward stepped closer, his breath reeking of bourbon. "Go on, boy. Show them." Samuel's eyes moved over the men, every face pale with amusement, their rings gleaming like small suns. He bent down, gripping the wagon they'd brought out from the stables. The wood creaked, the iron groaned, and in one fluid motion he lifted it. Muscles rippled, veins stood out like cords of rope. The crowd applauded. Edward clapped him on the shoulder a little too hard. "See, he's built like a bull, stronger than any white man here." "Careful, Edward," one of the guests chuckled. "One day that strength might turn on you." Edward laughed. "Not this one. I've beaten fear into him so deep, it's part of his bones." Samuel set the wagon down slowly. His breath came hard, but his eyes were steady. Edward leaned close, whispering low enough only he could hear. "You forget your place again. I'll have your tongue. You hear me, beast?" "Yes, master." The words were calm, but there was something in the way he said them, like the calm before lightning. Edward grinned, pleased with himself. He turned to his guests, lifting his glass. "To power," he toasted, "the only thing worth owning." They drank. The night stretched long. Samuel was ordered to haul barrels, lift tables, and stand silent while men wagered on how much he could carry. With each test, Edward laughed louder, drunker, prouder, as if owning Samuel's strength made him immortal. By midnight, most of the guests had left. Only Edward remained on the porch, his face red with drink, his voice slurred. "You think you're something, don't you?" he muttered, circling Samuel like a predator testing his prey. "Big man, quiet man, I see the way you look at me. You hate me." Samuel didn't respond. The silence only stoked Edward's fury. He struck him across the face with his cane. "Answer me." Samuel's head turned with the blow, but he didn't fall. His voice, low and deep, finally came. "No, master, I don't hate you." Edward sneered. "Liar." He struck him again. This time blood trickled from Samuel's lip. The others in the doorway, servants, field hands, stood frozen. They knew what defiance meant. They also knew what silence meant. Both drew blood. Edward grabbed his jaw, forcing him to meet his gaze. "You belong to me. Every inch, every muscle, every breath. You forget that, and I'll remind you." Samuel's eyes, dark burning, met his, and in that instant, something changed. Edward saw it a flicker, brief but unmistakable. Not fear, not submission, a promise. Edward pushed him back with disgust. "Get out of my sight." Samuel turned, walked down the porch steps into the darkness. The crickets screamed, and behind him the master's laughter echoed off the house like a curse. At the edge of the field, he stopped. His fists clenched until his knuckles cracked. His breath came hard. The moonlight painted his face in silver and shadow, half angel, half fury. He whispered to himself, voice low, broken, but certain. "One day, you'll look up at me and beg for the eyes you used to see with." The morning after the gathering broke, the air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia and iron. The plantation slept late, drained from its own cruelty. Only the fields stirred early rows of slaves already at work before the sun cleared the tree line. Samuel's shoulders ached from the night before, but he said nothing. His hands, cracked and bleeding, gripped the hoe like it was the last thing keeping him tethered to this earth. Each swing was a rhythm, a prayer, a slow beat of patience. From the hill, the white columns of the house gleamed through the trees. Every time the breeze shifted, the perfume of magnolia drifted across the fields, sweet and suffocating. It was a beautiful lie. The same trees that shaded Edward Hallow's porch had roots that drank from ground salted with tears. That morning, a small thing happened, small enough to go unnoticed by most. A bird, one of the bright red cardinals that usually sang from the treetops, fell dead from the branch above. No one saw it but Samuel. He looked down at it, tiny, weightless, beautiful, and thought, even heaven's creatures fall silent here. "Samuel." Aunt May's voice came from behind him, soft and cracked. She leaned on her walking stick, her eyes sharp despite the years. "You ain't restin' proper. You'll break yourself." He wiped his brow. "Rest don't change nothin', May." She watched him for a long moment. "You got something growin' inside you, child. Don't let it eat you. Hate's a fire that don't choose what it burns." Samuel paused, the hoe frozen mid-air. "What if the fire's all that's left?" May said nothing. The wind sighed through the magnolias. By midday, the overseer came with orders. "Master wants the field cleared by sundown," Caleb barked. "That flood by the creek's killin' the roots." He spat on the ground and rode off. Samuel worked harder, faster. But as he did, his mind drifted not to the pain, not to the hunger, but to the sound of Edward's laughter the night before, echoing like a curse. He could still see the glint in the man's eyes when he struck him. The memory burned hotter than the Sunday. When the day ended, Samuel didn't walk back to the quarters. He went instead toward the creek. The magnolia grove stretched wide and old, their blossoms white as ghosts. The ground there was soft, wet from the flood, and the roots tangled like serpents beneath the mud. He knelt, dipped his hands into the dark water, and stared at his reflection distorted by ripples. His own eyes stared back, calm and vast, yet filled with storms. "The day's comin'," he murmured. "One way or another, the ground gon' remember." The sound of hooves broke the stillness. Samuel turned. Edward Hallow rode down the path, alone, no guests, no guards, just the swagger of a man who thought himself untouchable. His horse whinnied as it neared the creek. "Didn't I tell you to clear this water path?" Edward called out. "You people don't listen unless the whip's talking." Samuel stood slowly, towering even taller against the fading Sunday. "Been working since dawn, sir. Water runs deep. Here. Ain't the kind that listens." Edward chuckled, dismounting. "Water don't listen. You don't listen." "Maybe I should start speaking louder." He stepped close, his boots sinking into the mud. "You think because you're strong, you can think? You forget. Boy, I own your body, your name, your breath." Samuel's gaze held steady. "A man can't own what ain't his, master." Edward froze, surprised by the quiet defiance in that tone. "What did you say?" "Only that water don't stay still forever," Samuel said evenly. "When it moves the earth." For a moment, silence ruled the grove. Even the cicadas stopped. Edward stared at him, uncertain if it was threat or madness. Then he barked a laugh. "You're getting poetic, giant. Maybe I've beat the sense right out of you." He turned, mounting his horse again. "You remember your place. The world don't take kindly to slaves who start talking in riddles." Samuel said nothing. As Edward rode off, the horse's hooves splashed through the creek, muddling the reflection. The ripples spread, carrying the red dust from Edward's boots into the water, a faint stain that drifted like smoke. That night, thunder rolled far off the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and earth through the quarters. Samuel sat outside under the eaves, eyes fixed on the distant house. The windows flickered with candlelight, and every flicker felt like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. Aunt May came to sit beside him. "You hear that storm coming?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes storms ain't here to destroy. Sometimes they wash the lies away." Samuel didn't answer. He just watched the horizon where the clouds rolled black as judgment. In his chest, that small ember of rebellion flared, not wild, not reckless, but steady. The kind of fire that waits until the world grows dry enough to burn on its own. By dawn, the rain began to fall, slow at first, then heavy, pounding the magnolia grove into a trembling sea of white petals and red mud. And beneath those trees, the ground began to shift, swallowing the last footprints of Edward's horse, as if the earth itself had decided to start remembering. The storm that rolled over Hallow Plantation left the world washed and strange. The morning light came pale and thin, falling across puddles that mirrored the sky. The fields steamed, the air still heavy with the smell of wet earth. The rain had been hard enough to flood the lower cotton rows, but to the slaves, that was mercy a day when the overseers stayed in and the whip stayed dry. Inside the quarters, fire crackled weakly in the old stove. People moved slow, speaking in half-whispers, as if afraid to disturb the strange quiet the storm had left behind. Aunt May sat by the fire, rubbing her knees. "Storm done took the bridge road clean off," she said to no one in particular. "Ain't no carriages comin' through for a while." That made a few of the field hands smile quietly. Isolation meant less watching eyes. Samuel sat by the window, carving wood with steady hands. He'd been making small shapes lately, birds mostly. He didn't say why, and no one asked. Each one was smooth, simple, something to do when silence was too heavy to bear. Isaac slipped in through the door, dripping from the rain. "They say the big barn flooded," he said. "Master's horses gone crazy. Caleb near got kicked in the head." A low chuckle rippled through the room. Even in sorrow, the people took what small joys they could find. But then Isaac lowered his voice. "And they say the master's been seeing things." Aunt May frowned. "What things?" Isaac shrugged, uneasy. "Says he keep waking in the night, seeing shadows in the hall. Says someone watching him from the window." May's expression hardened. Man like that always haunted by his own deeds. Ain't nothing supernatural about guilt. Samuel didn't look up. His knife kept moving, slow and deliberate. "What kind of shadows?" he asked finally. Isaac swallowed. He said they tall, too tall, like they fill the whole doorway, like they stand over his bed. The room went still for a moment, then someone snorted. Maybe the Lord finally looking down at him. Laughter broke the tension, quick and nervous. May shook her head. "Y'all don't talk like that. The devil don't need Callan, he lives close enough." But as night fell again over the plantation, the whispers didn't fade. The house lights burned later than usual. Edward's voice, sharp and slurred, could be heard shouting from the veranda. Bottles smashed. Caleb came storming down to the quarters once, demanding to know who'd been near the big house after sundown. No one answered. No one ever did. Samuel lay awake long after the others slept. The rain had stopped, but the air still hummed with something restless. He watched the flicker of lightning far off in the distance, soft and silent now. In his mind, he could see Edward pacing the halls, the proud master, stripped of peace, his own imagination turning on him. The thought didn't bring joy. It brought a strange, quiet satisfaction, not vengeance, but justice working in the dark. By morning, Caleb was limping, cursing under his breath. The storm had torn one of the big trees down by the paddock. The magnolia that shaded the house now leaned, its roots half upturned. Edward ordered it cut down. "I don't want that thing hanging over me," he barked. The men worked through the afternoon, sawing through the ancient trunk. When it finally fell, the ground shook like thunder, scattering blossoms and mud across the lawn. Samuel was there, hauling the debris. As the tree cracked open, something red seeped from the inside, not blood, just the color of rot and years of buried earth. Still, it made the onlookers shiver. Edward watched, his face pale. "Get it off my land," he ordered. Samuel paused, glancing up from the torn roots. "It's part of your land, sir, grown here longer than you've been breathin'." Edward's gaze snapped to him. For a moment, the air tightened, heavy and brittle, but Edward said nothing. He turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. That night, Samuel placed one of his carved birds on the windowsill. The storm had cleaned the sky, and the moonlight shone white over the fields. He sat beside Aunt May, both of them quiet, listening to the faint echoes drifting from the house. "You ever think he'll change?" Samuel asked. May didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, on the soft light of dawn beginning to touch the edges of the sky. "Men like him don't change," she said finally. "But the world around him does." Slow, quiet, then all at once. Samuel nodded, his eyes far away. "Then maybe the world already starting." May smiled faintly. "Maybe, child. Maybe." A single magnolia petal, carried by the wind, landed on the windowsill beside the little wooden bird. Samuel stared at it for a long time, a pale ghost against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the master's dog began to howl, long and mournful, as if sensing something unseen walking between the fields. The night carried an uneasy stillness over the ruins of Whitfield Manor. Once a place of pride and wealth, it now stood hollow, its halls echoing with the faint rustle of wind and memory. The master of the house, Jonathan Whitfield, sat in darkness long after the candles had burned down to waxy ghosts. His hands trembled, as if haunted by something unseen. Since that night, the night of Samuel's rebellion, Jonathan had not known rest. When he closed his eyes, he heard the slow, deliberate footsteps of the man he had once owned, the heavy tread of a giant who had learned that even chains could break. Each sound in the night made him startle. The scrape of branches became the whisper of vengeance. The creak of floorboards became the breath of something waiting in the dark. He told himself that Samuel was gone, that the man had vanished into the wilds like a spirit swallowed by the swamp. But guilt has a way of making ghosts, and so Jonathan began to see his former slave everywhere, in dreams, in mirrors, in the trembling of his own reflection. His servants left one by one, unnerved by his sudden fits and haunted mutterings. "He's cursed," they whispered in town. The giant marked him. Within months, the proud master had become a recluse, refusing daylight as though the sun itself might reveal his shame. Meanwhile, miles away, Samuel walked north beneath the same stars, unaware that his absence had become more powerful than his presence. The fear he had left behind was doing what years of preaching could not, teaching a cruel man the cost of cruelty. At night, Samuel would stop beside rivers and think of the life he had left behind. He did not take pleasure in what had happened. His heart was restless, not triumphant. But deep within, he knew that Jonathan Whitfield's sleeplessness was a small reflection of the endless nights he and so many others had endured under bondage. The tables had turned, not through blood, but through the silence that follows justice, the silence that keeps a man awake when the world around him demands sleep. Jonathan began writing letters to no one, his words breaking apart into confessions and pleas. "I see him still," one page read, "tall as a tree, with eyes that burn without light. I call for mercy, but none comes." He sent those letters nowhere. They piled up on his desk, unsent, until they were covered in dust. In a strange, poetic justice, Samuel's revenge had become eternal, a torment of conscience that no man could escape. For every lash, every command, every cruelty Jonathan had inflicted, the echo now returned to him in whispers and sleepless hours. The once mighty master of men had become a prisoner of his own memory. And Samuel, unknowingly, had learned his first lesson in power, that true strength is not in the hands that strike, but in the peace of the man who walks away. The road that led northward was not a single path, but a winding maze of rivers, forests, and quiet fields where the sound of a man's footsteps could mean salvation or capture. Samuel Rivers moved through that wilderness like a shadow, following whispers and instincts more than maps. Each night brought a new sound, the hoot of an owl, the bark of a dog, the distant rattle of wagon wheels, and Samuel learned to read them all. Freedom, he discovered, was not the loud cry of victory. It was the soft breath of survival. He carried little: a worn coat, a piece of bread, and a faith in motion. But what sustained him most were the voices, faint, fleeting, yet clear as bells in his memory. Some were voices from his past: his mother's steady hum when the nights grew long, the laughter of other slaves who found moments of joy even within cages, the harsh orders of overseers that now echoed only as distant thunder. Other voices belonged to those he met along the way. The first came from a small farmhouse on the edge of a tobacco field, where a window flickered just once before going dark again. It was a signal, a secret language, known only to those who risked everything for others' freedom. Inside, an old woman named Ruth took him in. She did not ask who he was. She didn't have to. The look in his eyes told her everything. "You're running," she said simply. "I'm walking toward something," he replied. She smiled at that. That's the better way to say it. For one night, Samuel slept in a bed, a kindness he hadn't known since childhood. But even as he closed his eyes, his mind wandered back to the plantation. He could almost feel the air of that place, thick with the weight of command and fear. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ruth placed her hand on his arm. "The world's changing," she whispered. "But change don't come gentle. It comes with fire and pain. You've already seen the fire. Now walk through the pain." By morning, Samuel was gone. He didn't look back. He never did anymore. The road demanded forward motion, and the north, that great promise of freedom, was waiting. As he passed through villages and woods, he began to hear his own story traveling faster than his feet. Some called him the Giant of Richmond. Others spoke of the slave who made his master beg the heavens for mercy. Each retelling was different, part truth, part myth. Some said he carried chains as trophies. Others claimed he vanished into mist when soldiers approached. Samuel listened but said nothing. He knew the truth, and it was enough. Still, those stories followed him like a trail of smoke, impossible to grasp, but impossible to hide from. Every mile north, the myth grew taller than the man himself. One night, beneath a sky pale with moonlight, Samuel met a young conductor of the Underground Railroad named Thomas. Thin, pale, with eyes too bright for the danger he carried, Thomas studied Samuel for a long time before speaking. "They say you made a man see his own sins," he said. Samuel looked down at his hands, scarred but steady. "I didn't make him see. The truth did that." Thomas nodded slowly. Truth can blind a man faster than light. They shared no more words, only a silent understanding that freedom had a cost, and both of them were paying it in their own ways. By the time dawn came, Samuel had crossed another river and left Virginia behind. But in the water's reflection, for a fleeting second, he thought he saw something. The faint outline of the man he used to be. Standing on the shore, watching him go. And for the first time since leaving the plantation, Samuel whispered a prayer not for vengeance, but for peace. Freedom, Samuel discovered, was heavier than any chain he had ever worn. At first, he imagined liberty would feel like air, light, invisible, unbound. Yet every sunrise on the road north revealed that freedom carried its own burden, the weight of choice. The enslaved had no choices, their paths were chosen for them. But now, with no master's voice to follow, every fork in the trail demanded an answer. Every step asked who he wished to become. The morning mist clung to him like memory. His feet ached from days of walking through clay and frost. His body ached from years of labor. But his mind was the battlefield now. He would stop sometimes and ask himself if he deserved this liberty bought at such a cost. Could peace grow from vengeance? Could a man whose hands once shook with rage now build a life shaped by gentleness? At a crossing of two rivers, Samuel met a group of travelers, freedmen, heading toward Pennsylvania. They had heard of him, though they did not recognize him at first. One spoke softly by the fire, telling the tale of a giant who frightened a master into madness. Samuel listened without interruption. The man in the story was half legend, half ghost, a figure of impossible strength and calm fury. When they asked Samuel where he came from, he answered only, "South," and left it there. The group moved together for 3 days. They shared stories of loss and hope, of mothers left behind and children hidden away in secret places. Freedom had stitched them together like fragments of a torn quilt. Yet even among them, Samuel felt apart. His silence made them curious, his sighs made them cautious. The others carried songs to keep despair away. Samuel carried a silence that did the same. On the 4th day, they reached a Quaker settlement tucked between rolling hills. It was there Samuel met Rebecca Morrison, the woman whose name he would later remember like a prayer. She stood at the edge of the field in a grey bonnet, her hands steady, her eyes calm in a way that unsettled him. She greeted each traveler with the same quiet warmth, offering bread and water as though such simple acts were sacraments. When she came to Samuel, she paused a moment longer. "Thee has walked far," she said. Her voice had no fear, only recognition. "I have," Samuel answered, "and thee has left much behind." He nodded. She studied him a moment more. "Freedom is a beginning, not an ending. The hardest road lies ahead of thee." That night, under her roof, Samuel felt something he had not known since boyhood. Safety without suspicion. He ate slowly, listening to the low hum of conversation among the others. Rebecca read aloud from a small worn Bible, her words soft but firm. "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Samuel wondered if truth could truly free him, or if it had simply bound him in another way. The truth of what he'd done, of who he had become, was carved deep in him like the scars on his back. Yet as he listened, he realized that perhaps freedom was not meant to erase pain, but to carry it with dignity. When he lay down to sleep, he dreamed not of chains, but of a great open field. In that dream, the air was warm, the soil soft beneath his feet, and the sky vast enough to hold every memory without crushing him. But when he woke, the field faded, and the world returned to frost and shadow. Still, the dream stayed with him, like a promise whispered in another tongue. Rebecca handed him a map at dawn, a piece of parchment marked with symbols only those of the Underground Railroad would recognize. "Follow the stars, follow the kindness of strangers, but trust thine own spirit most," she told him. "Thee has a story to finish." He did not yet know what that story would become. He only knew that the journey north was more than escape, it was transformation. Freedom was not the absence of chains, it was learning how to walk without them. As he stepped into the cold morning light, the settlement behind him faded into mist, and the horizon opened like a blank page. For the first time, Samuel felt the faint, trembling beginning of forgiveness, not for Jonathan Whitfield, but for himself. He still carried his past like a shadow, but it no longer dragged him down. It walked beside him instead, silent and heavy, a companion he neither welcomed nor could leave behind. The road stretched northward, endless and uncertain. Yet, for the first time, Samuel did not measure distance in miles, but in moments of peace between the memories. Each breath, each heartbeat, was a small act of defiance. Each step was freedom, practiced and earned, and above him, the sky was vast and forgiving, a silent witness to a man learning, step by step, what it meant to be free. By the time Samuel reached the borderlands between Maryland and Pennsylvania, his name had already crossed ahead of him. The man himself walked quietly, head bent against the wind, but the stories raced like wildfire. He became a symbol people could hold in their mouths when they were too afraid to speak their own truth. They called him the giant of the tidewater, the shadow walker, the slave who broke his chains, and the heavens listened. Each version made him larger, stranger, more myth than flesh. And as the tales spread, Samuel began to feel the distance grow between who he was and who the world imagined him to be. He passed through villages where whispers preceded his arrival. Children stared at him from doorways, old men nodded without speaking. One night, in a tavern meant for freedmen, he heard his own story sung in a mournful tune, a ballad of vengeance and mercy mixed in the same breath. The singer, a thin man with a cracked fiddle, looked straight at Samuel as he sang. They say he made the master kneel, and heaven wept to see it reel. But when the dawn began to rise, he walked away and closed his eyes. When the song ended, Samuel slipped out into the cold. The moon hung low over the fields, and the wind carried the smell of smoke and pine. He stood there for a long while, wondering if legends ever let the men inside them rest. The truth was simpler. Samuel was tired. He was a man of flesh and scars, not miracles. He had no taste for heroics, only for the quiet kind of peace that didn't come easily to men who had seen too much. Yet everywhere he went, people sought the legend, not the man. They wanted to touch his hand, hear the story from his lips, draw courage from his shadow. Sometimes he wished to tell them he was still learning what courage truly meant, that it wasn't rage or sighs or defiance, but the steady choice to keep walking toward light, even when darkness offered rest. In one northern town, he found work at a blacksmith's forge. The hammer felt familiar in his hands. It was the same rhythm that once struck chains, only now it shaped tools for harvest. The blacksmith, a white abolitionist named Ezra Pike, treated him not as a curiosity but as a man. Ezra spoke little, preferring the conversation of metal and fire. In that silence, Samuel found comfort. One afternoon as they worked, Ezra said, "You've got strength enough to shape mountains, but what are you shaping for yourself?" Samuel wiped sweat from his brow. "A name I can live inside," he said quietly. Ezra nodded. "Then start with this. Build something no man can own but you." So Samuel built a plow. It was simple, sturdy, honest work. He carved his initials into the wood, not as pride, but as proof that his hands could create rather than destroy. When the plow was finished, Ezra refused payment. "Consider it the first thing the world owes you back," he said. Weeks passed. The forge became home of sorts. But even in peace, rumors trailed him. A bounty hunter came through town one evening, asking questions about a runaway who fit the description. The townsfolk denied knowing him, though several exchanged nervous glances toward the forge. Samuel said nothing. He waited until the man rode away, then packed his few belongings before dawn. He could not risk others for his safety. He left the plow behind. In its place, he carved a single word into the table where he'd eaten his meals: free. The road called him north again. In every passing town, he heard faint versions of his story growing grander. One woman claimed he had turned water into blood to frighten a plantation owner. Another said he spoke to spirits who guided him through the night. Samuel didn't correct them. Myths had their purpose. They gave the voiceless a language of strength, a way to believe that justice might still walk the earth in human form. But late at night, beside his small fire, he sometimes wondered what would remain when the legend faded, when his body grew old and his story became someone else's. Was freedom only for the living, or could it survive beyond the man who sought it? Once, as he crossed into Pennsylvania, a group of escaped slaves recognized him. They knelt before him in gratitude. The sight filled him with both sorrow and awe. He raised them gently to their feet and said, "Don't kneel to any man. Freedom, don't bow." His voice was steady, yet it trembled with feeling. In that moment, he realized his journey was no longer only his own. It had become a current, carrying others forward. That night, he camped beside a frozen creek. The stars above were so bright they hurt his eyes. He thought of the man he once served, the man who had begged for sight, and how blindness came not from darkness but from pride. Samuel felt no hatred now, only a strange pity. Perhaps that was the final act of revenge, to live well enough that even memory lost its teeth. As dawn approached, the wind softened. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly through the frost. Samuel listened and smiled. The rumor of himself could keep traveling if it needed to. He had no more use for it. The man was enough. He rose, stretched his arms toward the pale horizon, and began walking again, not as the giant, not as the avenger, but simply as Samuel Rivers, a man learning the shape of peace. By the time spring melted the frost from the hills, Samuel Rivers had learned that a name could be both a burden and a beacon. His had become a whispered prayer, a rallying cry, a song sung in secret. But when he heard strangers speak his name, it no longer felt like his own. He had carried it across rivers, through forests, into the trembling dawns of new beginnings. Yet with each mile, he shed another piece of the man who had first worn it. The Samuel who once belonged to another man's ledger was gone. What remained was someone undefined, still being shaped by the journey itself. He found work again in a small town near Lancaster, a place where people asked few questions. There, he helped raise barns and dig wells, his hands always busy, his voice seldom heard. The farmers respected him for his strength, but what struck them most was his silence. He spoke only when necessary, and even then, his words carried a gravity that made others listen. Children followed him sometimes, wide-eyed, calling him the giant. He would smile faintly and keep walking, though inside, the word tugged at something deep within him, a reminder that people saw his size before his story, his myth before his truth. One evening, after a long day of work, Samuel sat by the riverbank watching the sunset bleed into the water. The colors reminded him of fire, not the kind that destroyed, but the kind that purified. As he watched, a voice startled him. "You look like you're waiting on the water to answer something," a woman said. He turned and saw a figure standing behind him, a black woman, young but with eyes that had seen enough sorrow to fill lifetimes. Her name was Clara, and she had come north with her 2 sons, guided by a preacher and the stars. "I listen to it," Samuel replied softly. "Sometimes the water remembers more than people do." She smiled at that and sat beside him. The boys played nearby, throwing stones that skipped across the river's skin. "They say your name down south like it's magic," she said. "Said you scared the devil out of men who thought they were gods." Samuel chuckled, low and tired. "Stories grow the farther they travel. I'm just a man who kept walking." "Maybe," she said. "But you kept walking so others could." They sat in silence a while longer, the sound of the river filling the spaces between their breaths. Then Clara asked, "What will you do now that you're free?" Samuel hesitated. It was a question he had avoided for months. "I don't know yet. Freedom ain't an answer, it's a question that keeps asking itself." Clara nodded slowly. "Then maybe you'll find your answer where peace lives." That night, Samuel dreamed again. In his dream, he stood in a vast field of wheat, swaying under a warm wind. Far away, a bell rang slow, solemn, steady. He followed the sound until he came upon a small wooden church with no doors. Inside, sunlight poured through the cracks, falling on rows of empty pews. At the altar, carved into the wood, was his name, Samuel Rivers. He touched it, and it shimmered like running water. Then the letters began to fade, one by one, until nothing was left but the grain of the wood, plain, unmarked, free. When he woke, dawn had already broken. Clara and her sons were gone, leaving only a piece of cloth folded beside the fire, a simple scarf sewn from different fabrics, a patchwork of journeys. It was a gift, and Samuel understood its meaning. Freedom was never one color, one path, one name. It was many lives, stitched together by endurance. He tied the scarf around his wrist and continued north. Each town he entered greeted him differently. Some welcomed him with warmth, others looked away, fearful of what he represented. In every place, though, his name echoed in hymns, in whispers, in the rhythm of work songs that rose from fields where chains had once clattered. And then, one day, he came upon a small gathering in a field. Men and women stood beneath a tree, singing softly. He stopped to listen. The song was one he knew, a spiritual that slaves had sung under the moon, a song of waiting and redemption. When the last verse ended, an old man turned and looked straight at Samuel. His eyes widened in recognition. "You're him," he breathed. "I'm no one special," Samuel said, but the man shook his head. "No, you're the one they said would come, the one whose name made masters tremble and slaves believe." Samuel lowered his gaze. "I came to listen, not to lead." The old man smiled gently. "Sometimes listening is leading." They shared a meal together, and Samuel stayed until the stars appeared. The gathering was not about worship or legend, it was about remembrance. Every story told that night carried the same pulse, the desire to live free, not just in body, but in soul. When he finally rose to leave, the old man pressed something into his hand, a small carved figure of a man standing tall, arms open to the sky. "For when you forget who you are," he said. Samuel thanked him and continued walking until the music faded into the night. As the road stretched ahead, he realized the truth. His name had outgrown him, and maybe that was how it should be. He had walked from bondage into legend, but the legend no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone who whispered his story to the wind. And so, Samuel Rivers kept moving, carrying only his silence, his scars, and the faint echo of his name, not as a burden now, but as a song that would outlive even memory. The first sign of the past returning was not a letter, nor a man's voice, but a dream. Samuel had taken shelter in a quiet Pennsylvania village, working in a carpenter's shed where the smell of pine filled the air like prayer. Days passed in rhythm, the steady knock of hammer on wood, the sweep of sawdust across the floor, the peace of honest work. He slept beneath a small window that caught the morning light, believing the past had finally released its grip. But one night, the light in his dream was wrong. It was a golden haze that belonged to another place, a field scorched by sun and memory. In that dream, he saw a figure standing by the old cotton press, his back bent, his hands trembling. The man turned, and Samuel recognized him instantly. Jonathan Whitfield, not as he was proud and cruel, but as something smaller, fragile, emptied of command. His once perfect coat was torn, his eyes dimmed by something more than blindness. He reached out toward Samuel, but no words came, only the faint sound of wind passing through hollow wood. Samuel woke with a start. The dream clung to him like sweat, the air heavy with the scent of pine and old fear. He sat there for a long time, listening to his own heartbeat. He had not spoken or thought the man's name in months, and yet here he was, summoned by memory, by guilt, by some unfinished chord in the soul. For several days, Samuel said nothing, but the dreams kept returning, each one clearer than the last. In one, the master wandered through an empty house, calling for help. In another, he sat at a well with no rope, whispering Samuel's name over and over as though it might bring him water. The dreams did not frighten Samuel. They troubled him for another reason. They stirred compassion, he thought, long buried. And compassion, he realized, could feel heavier than hate. One morning, unable to bear the silence, he visited the village church. It was a small white building at the edge of a meadow, its steeple leaning slightly as if bowing to the wind. Inside, the air was cool and still. The preacher, an older man with silver hair, greeted him quietly. "Brother Rivers," he said, for by now the whole town knew his name, "you look like a man carrying a ghost." Samuel gave a faint smile. "Not a ghost, maybe, just a shadow that refuses to fade." The preacher nodded, waiting. Samuel sat down on the front bench, his large hands clasped together. "I thought I left him behind," he said slowly, "but now he visits me, in dreams, as if he's still waiting for something from me." The preacher said nothing for a while. Then, softly, "Sometimes the ones who wronged us keep a piece of our spirit until we take it back." "How does a man do that?" Samuel asked. "By seeing them as they are, not as they were. By forgiving the weakness that made them cruel." Samuel stared at the floorboards. Forgiveness. The word felt foreign, heavy, almost arrogant. He had been wronged in ways that no apology could undo. Yet, as he thought of the blind, broken figure in his dreams, he realized that perhaps his old master had already punished himself more completely than Samuel ever could. That night, Samuel walked to the edge of the meadow. The sky was low with clouds, the air filled with the smell of rain. He knelt by a stream and spoke aloud, not to the master, but to the memory of him. "I don't owe you words," he began, his voice rough, "but I'll give them anyway. You took years from me, pieces I can't get back. You taught me fear, and you called it order. You made me strong, though you meant to break me. And now, what's left of you walks in my sleep, begging for sight." He paused, watching the ripples spread across the water. "I can't give you back what you lost," he said quietly, "but I won't carry your darkness anymore. You can keep it. I'm done." The rain came slowly at first, then harder, washing away the last traces of his words. In that downpour, Samuel felt something uncoil inside him, not release, not joy, but peace, the kind of peace that comes from closing a door that has been opened too long. When he returned to the carpenter's shed, he found a letter waiting. It had traveled far, from the south. The handwriting was unfamiliar, uneven. He opened it with care. "Mr. Rivers, the man who once owned you has passed. They say he died quietly, eyes open but unseeing. Before he went, he asked that word reach you. He said you were the last thing he remembered clearly. A friend." Samuel folded the paper slowly. There were no tears, no triumph, only a deep stillness, as though time itself had taken a breath and let it out. He stepped outside, into the night washed clean by rain. The air was cool and gentle. Above him, the stars blinked, faintly distant. countless, unjudging. For a long while, Samuel stood there, looking up. Then he whispered, "Rest, if you can." He turned back toward the shed, where the smell of cut wood and oil waited for him, the scent of the life he had built with his own hands. And in that moment, he felt it fully for the first time. He was free. Not from chains, not from the past, but from the shadow that once followed him wherever he went. By the time Samuel reached Ontario, the air itself felt different, sharper, cleaner, heavy with pine and the promise of quiet. The first thing he noticed was the sound, not the crack of a whip or the rustle of overseers, but wind moving through tall trees, a music older than any song he had ever known. For years afterward, that sound would mean freedom to him, the breath of a land where no man could be owned. The community that welcomed him was small, a scattering of wooden houses clustered around a field of wheat and a modest church built by hands that had once known only chains. Every face that greeted him carried its own history of loss and endurance. They did not ask about his past. They simply recognized it in his eyes. Samuel began to build a life the only way he knew how, with labor. His enormous hands, once instruments of survival, became tools of creation. He helped raise fences, mend roofs, and carve planks for homes. The rhythm of work steadied him. Every nail driven into wood was a promise to himself that he was more than what had been done to him. At night, he sat by the fire with Mary, the woman who would one day become his wife, listening to the wind through the cracks of the cabin walls. She was quiet, with a strength that did not shout. Her laughter was rare but honest, the kind that could heal something in a man's chest. "You build like you're trying to erase something," she said once, watching him smooth the edge of a table he'd made. "Maybe I am," he replied, "or maybe I'm trying to build something strong enough to hold what I remember." Mary smiled softly. "Wood remembers too," she said, "but it doesn't let its scars ruin its beauty. It just carries them." That night, he looked at his own hands and thought about that. The scars, the cracks, the lines of work and war, none of them would ever disappear. But maybe they didn't need to. The settlement grew. Word spread across the border that a man named Samuel Rivers was helping build houses faster than anyone could count. Some came just to see the giant the stories spoke of, expecting a myth. What they found instead was a man who worked until his shirt was dark with sweat, who lifted timbers as easily as other men lifted words, and who spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already lived through the worst that life could offer. He taught younger men how to shape wood, how to steady a roof beam in a storm, how to build a door that would not bow to wind. But he also taught something quieter, that true strength was not in the hand, but in the will. "A house built from hate won't stand," he told them once, "but a house built from silence, from patience, can outlast a man." The years passed gently, though never easily. Each spring brought floods, each winter brought hunger, but they endured. Samuel's home became a gathering place, not grand, but warm. Travelers came through from the south, carrying whispers of the world they had escaped. New laws, new wars, old cruelties returning in different forms. Samuel listened more than he spoke. He had learned that some pain was shared best through silence. When his first child was born, he held the baby in his arms like something sacred. For the first time, he understood what freedom meant, not just for himself, but for the life that would never know the sound of chains. He built a cradle by hand, smoothing each curve with care. As the baby slept, he whispered a promise that no child of his would ever live as property. Years later, his home became more than a refuge. It became a way station. Fugitives from the south, guided by the secret paths of the Underground Railroad, found food and shelter there. Mary would keep a lamp burning in the window, a signal that the house was safe. Samuel met them at the door, offering bread, water, and a place to rest. Some recognized his name. "Are you him?" they'd whisper. "The one they talk about down there, the giant who fought back?" He never confirmed it. He only said, "I'm a man who got away." And then he'd hand them a blanket and point them toward the barn where they could sleep. At night, after they were gone, he would sit by the window and think of how far he had come and how many others still had miles to travel. Freedom, he realized, was not a place. It was a relay, a torch passed hand to hand in the dark. One evening, his eldest son, now old enough to help in the fields, asked him, "Papa, why do you always work so late?" Samuel smiled faintly. Because I remember what it's like to have nothing to build for, he said. Now I do. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of the words. As time moved on, the settlement flourished. The church bells rang on Sundays, children ran through fields that had once been swamps, and the sky over the village seemed wider than before. Samuel's house stood at its heart, simple, square, solid, a monument not of victory, but of endurance. He named it Haven Hollow, a place carved out of silence, filled with the echoes of laughter and life. To outsiders, it was just another home. To those who knew his story, it was a cathedral built from forgiveness and stubborn hope. And in quiet moments, when the wind passed through the cracks in the walls, Samuel would close his eyes and listen. Sometimes it sounded like music, sometimes it sounded like memory, but always it sounded free. By the time Samuel Rivers's hair turned the color of winter ash, the village he'd helped raise had grown into something that no one could have imagined when he first crossed the border. Haven Hollow had a school, a bell tower, and fields that shimmered gold each summer. Children born free ran between rows of corn, shouting names that had never been entered in any master's ledger. Every morning, Samuel walked the same path to the river. The mist hung low, curling around the water like breath. He carried a small wooden staff, now less for support than for memory. Each notch in it marked a year since his arrival. When he touched them, he remembered faces, those who'd built alongside him, those who'd fled through the night, and those whose names were known only to God. Freedom, he'd come to understand, was not light. It had weight. It pressed against a man's chest with the knowledge of what it cost. He could never forget the others who hadn't made it north, who had vanished between the swamps and the sea. Their absence followed him like a second shadow. At church one Sunday, the preacher asked him to speak. Samuel stood slowly, his frame still towering, though age had softened it. "You all know I ain't one for talking long," he began, the deep rhythm of his voice filling the room. "But I've been thinking about what freedom really is. Some folks think it means doing what you please. Some think it's owning land. But freedom, to me, is the chance to live without hate burning in your belly." He paused, looking around the room. Faces young and old watched him, farmers, mothers, children. "Hate is a chain too," he said. "You carry it, and it drags you just the same." After the service, a young man approached him, one of those who'd come north only a year earlier. "How did you do it?" he asked quietly. "How did you stop hating them?" Samuel smiled, a tired, gentle curve of his lips. "I didn't," he said. "I just learned not to feed it, let hunger starve it out." That night, sitting on the porch with Mary, he told her about the question. She was knitting by lamplight, her fingers sure and steady. "You always were better at forgiving than most," she said. He shook his head. "Forgiveness ain't weakness," he said. "It's just letting go of something that was never yours to carry forever." She nodded. "Maybe," she said softly, "but you carried it long enough to build something strong from it." When Mary passed a few years later, Samuel buried her beneath the old oak behind the house. He carved the headstone himself. "Mary Rivers, she taught the wind to sing." For weeks afterward, he spoke little. But he kept working, tending the garden, fixing fences, and showing younger hands how to build the way she would have wanted. Sometimes travelers still came through, guided by the same invisible road he had once followed. Samuel fed them, offered rest, and listened. Many came from places that had changed only in name. The world, it seemed, had a prevalent, long memory, yet each story of flight and survival reminded him that the work was never finished, that freedom needed tending like a field. Years drifted on. The day came when his son and daughter stood before him, grown, their own children at their sides. "Papa," his son said, "the townsfolk want to name the new hall after you." Samuel laughed, a sound deep and surprised. "I just swung a hammer," he said. "You built more than houses," his daughter told him. "You built a way for people to stand upright." He said nothing for a while, just stared at the horizon where the sun was setting behind the pines. Then he said, "If they do, tell them to make the doors wide. Freedom ought to fit everyone." In his final years, Samuel spent his mornings by the river and his evenings near the fire, whittling small wooden figures, birds, boats, open hands. He gave them to children who visited, telling each one, "Carry this with you. It remembers the road." On his last night, as the fire dimmed, he dreamed he was back in the fields of Georgia, only they were green and unchained, stretching out to an endless sky. The master's house was gone. In its place stood a single tree, tall and bright with leaves. Beneath it, he saw the faces of those he had lost, smiling, whole, and free. When morning came, the wind moved through Haven Hollow like a hymn. They found him in his chair by the window, eyes closed, a half-carved bird still in his hands. The dawn light spilled across his face, soft and gold. It looked, some said, as if he had simply stood up and walked into the morning. They buried him beside Mary, beneath the oak that had watched over them both. The community gathered farmers, children, travelers, all those whose lives had crossed his path. The preacher spoke of strength, of labor, of grace. But the people spoke of something else, of quiet, of patience, of a man who had taught them that freedom was not the end of the road, but road itself. Years later, when strangers passed through the village, they would sometimes stop at the old house and touch the wooden doorframe. They said it felt warm, as though the hands that had built it still lingered there. And when the wind swept down from the north, rustling the fields and the trees, those who listened closely swore they could hear a low voice in the air, calm, steady, and free, whispering the same words Samuel once told every soul who sought refuge under his roof: "Build something that will outlast your pain."